I was born into a family whose history reaches back to the Dark Ages, when people still believed that monstrous creatures lurked in the dark forests and that moonlit paths could cause any traveler to vanish. My ancestors were the keepers of knowledge about beings that have no place in biology textbooks, yet whose existence is etched into ancient chronicles and runic scrolls. As a child, my grandmother would show me thick manuscripts with yellowed pages, filled with strange symbols and drawings that sent shivers down my spine. The silent illustrations depicted beasts with glowing eyes, enormous fangs, and unnatural limbs. I didn't fully understand what I was seeing at the time, but I felt that behind those pages lay a reality that tolerated no disbelief. As I grew up, I delved deeper into the study of my family's secrets. I read about various cryptids, from shaggy beasts hiding in mountain caves to werewolves capable of assuming human form. Every line carried a warning. Respect their power and be cautious, for they are the shadow slipping past the eyes of ordinary folk. Many who encountered these creatures never returned, and those who survived were driven mad by what they saw. I learned to sense their presence, to track the barely noticeable signs on the ground, and to recognize the predatory magic woven into thickets and old houses. In time, I was recognized as the heir to the craft of the hunter. I mastered the secrets of rituals that, when properly performed, could immobilize or even banish a creature back to its lair. I learned how to prepare protective amulets, how to correctly inscribe special symbols on weapons, and how to use herbs capable of weakening inhuman entities. Thus, I became a cryptid hunter, a guardian of the boundary between our world and the terrifying mysteries hidden in the darkness. Society tends to dismiss stories of werewolves and monsters as mere fabrications. People watch horror movies, read mystical novels, and brush off such tales in real life. But when children begin to disappear in remote areas and mutilated animals are found in the wilderness, most prefer to search for rational explanations. Only a few know that such brutality is sometimes the work of beings that are not spoken of aloud. I was one of those few, and the responsibility fell upon me to ensure that these ancient horrors did not emerge from the shadows to announce themselves to the world. One day, I heard about a series of mysterious attacks in a remote rural area. Rumors attributed everything to something resembling a wolf man. Nocturnal howls, mutilated bodies discarded in ditches, massive paw prints in soft earth, and scratches on trees as if someone were marking their territory. The few witnesses brave enough to speak out described eyes burning in the darkness and bared fangs. I understood that to most, these were nothing more than village tales, ghost stories told around a campfire. But referring to the manuscripts of my ancestors, I knew that such beings were mentioned as dogmen, a primordial breed of lycanthropes endowed with advanced intelligence and inhuman ferocity. My lineage had encountered such creatures more than once, and wherever a dogman appeared, chaos ensued. People disappeared, fear crept into every mind, and a chilling howl echoed through the nights. I understood that it was crucial to act quickly and decisively before panic gripped the surrounding villages and the monster sensed impunity. Gathering my amulets, ritual items, and weapons, I set off for that very backwoods where, according to rumors, the latest attacks had occurred. The place I was headed to had long been abandoned, a sort of ghost from the past. Once teeming with life, a series of mysterious events and the terror of the nocturnal beast had driven people away, leaving only a handful of old-timers and empty houses. I knew that it was there I would find traces of the creature whispered about by the locals. Thus began my new quest, hunting what is generally dismissed as a myth. Yet I was convinced that behind the darkness of any tale always lies a truth. and the dogman is the ominous symbol of that truth, a truth I could not afford to ignore. My journey to the place where death itself seemed frozen took several hours. The road was narrow, winding between empty fields and overgrown groves, with decrepit signposts pointing somewhere back into the past. When I finally saw the first dilapidated houses of the village, it felt as though I were entering a space cut off from time. Ragged walls, crooked fences, and paths choked with weeds all spoke of a place long forsaken by visitors, where no one hoped for a better future. I parked my car by an abandoned well, once used to draw water, now standing like a stone monument to a lost way of life. The air was heavy with the scent of damp decay, mixed with a faint bitterness of scorched leaves. Overhead, black ravens circled, cawing as if mocking every lone traveler who dared to venture here. I stepped out and felt the soft, moisture-soaked earth beneath my feet, as if the land itself were weeping under the weight of its grim history. Despite its apparent emptiness, the village was not entirely dead. Far off on the outskirts, I noticed a faint lamp glow, and in a window frame, the shadow of a human figure flickered by. I felt scrutinizing gazes from behind curtained windows. Those locals who still remained here clearly showed little enthusiasm at the sight of a stranger. Some stepped onto their porches, but upon seeing me, they only cast down gloomy glances. I heard not a word from them, yet I understood that the terror of the nocturnal horror had rendered them silent. Or perhaps they simply did not want to speak of what the land concealed. To gather as much information as possible, I slowly made my way along the main street, if one could call it that. The surviving houses appeared as ghostly as the people once were. Roofs caved in here and there, with rusty tools and broken pieces of furniture strewn in the courtyards. I recalled old records mentioning that the village had once thrived. It had a mill, a forge, and even a small church. Over time, the road was rerouted, trade dwindled, and many left for the city. It was said that in those quiet, desolate years, strange disappearances of livestock and the rare, horrifying vanishings of people began to occur. A little further on, I came upon a small church standing in isolation on a rise. Its moss-covered walls, crooked doors, and windows with shattered glass gave it the look of a building staring blankly into emptiness. I stepped inside and was met with a suffocating blend of dust and mold. The old pews were broken and fragments of paper lay scattered on the floor. As I left the church, I noticed a feeble old man sitting on a low bench. He stared at me in silence, his eyes a mixture of distrust and fear. I made no effort to approach or question him. His very appearance spoke volumes about what the remaining villagers had endured. When people are too afraid to speak, it means their terror has sunk deep into their bones, disturbing them even in the daylight. Planning to spend the night, I found an abandoned house that seemed more or less suitable for setting up camp and unpacking my gear. From the outside, it looked slightly better than the others. Its sturdy walls still held together, and the door, though creaky, would close. Inside, a heavy smell of stagnation filled the space, and the floorboards sagged underfoot. I brushed off a thick layer of dust from the windowsill, and gazing through the murky pane, felt an odd sense of apprehension. Every rustle behind the wall, every whisper of wind now seemed like a potential sign of a creature lurking in the night. Thus ended my first day in the abandoned village. I had yet to receive any answers, but I already understood that I was amidst a collective terror gnawing away at the already meager lives of the locals. Before bed, I laid out my amulets on the windowsill, checked my weapons, and unfurled scrolls detailing encounters with lycanthropes. Night was approaching, and I knew there was much work ahead, and little time for doubts. At the first light of dawn, I left the abandoned house. I needed to find concrete evidence of the creature whispered about in ominous rumors. My plan was to explore the surrounding area, particularly the forest's edge, usually where tangible traces of cryptids can be found. The village greeted me with a gloomy gray, a low, rain-threatening sky, and the scent of decaying leaves drifting through the courtyards of empty homes. I walked along old fences once used to contain livestock and headed toward the edge of the village where a dark wall of forest began. The dense canopy formed a monolithic barrier, and the path between was buried under fallen leaves and brush. Even though I had encountered the supernatural before, as I neared the forest, a deep inner tremor gripped me. My instincts told me that within those woods lay the key to unraveling the recent bloody events. The ground at the forest's edge was damp, nearly swampy, and every step squelched in the mud. I knew that if the creature had passed through here at night, it would have left its marks in the softened earth. Squatting down, I carefully examined a spot where depressions in the soil were visible. At first glance, the prints resembled those of a wolf, yet their unnatural proportions and deep impressions immediately stood out. These tracks were not only wider than normal, but arranged in a way that suggested the creature moved on two legs, occasionally using its front paws for support. I ran my fingers along one of the prints and felt that its edges were faintly coated with something sticky, perhaps slime or secretions from a beast that could not be attributed to any ordinary forest dweller. I decided to venture further into the thicket, noting every oddity. In some spots, the grass was flattened and pushed to one side, as if a large beast had burst through the underbrush at high speed. Here and there, broken branches lay at nearly 2 meters high, suggesting that the creature's stature or leap far exceeded that of an ordinary wolf. Yet the most chilling aspect was that every discovery seemed part of a continuous trail leading deeper into the forest, away from the village and human eyes. Stopping beside an old pine tree cloaked in moss, I noticed deep, vertical scratches. Jagged grooves in the bark penetrated into the wood by a good 1.5 centimeters. Proof that the creature's claws were not only sharp, but extraordinarily long. Closer inspection revealed dark streaks, resembling dried fluid. Perhaps it was the blood of a recent kill. I couldn't be sure. But even a cursory glance made it clear. Neither wolf nor bear could leave such neat, deep marks as if made by enormous scythe-like blades. Continuing my search, I discovered other clues. Torn clumps of fur caught in thorny brush. Although the fur appeared gray, a closer look revealed a peculiar rigidity and a glossy sheen, as if it had a different structure altogether. I carefully gathered several tufts to examine later under a magnifying glass, comparing them with the descriptions in my family's manuscripts. In theory, this find could belong to any animal, but my intuition screamed that I was on the hot trail of the dogman, a creature whose characteristics exactly matched what I had seen on the ground and the trees. Passing a small clearing, I suddenly came upon another paw print, this time clearer and larger than the previous ones. The soil here was softer and the imprint was deeper, as if the beast had paused for a moment. The outline clearly showed curved claws, and the impression of the heel suggested that the paw was at least 1.5 times larger than that of a wolf. Goosebumps raced over my skin. Could the creature be growing in size, or were there several of them? This thought nagged at me. If more than one dogman was out there, my task would become exponentially more complicated. After collecting samples of soil from the edge of the print and a few more fragments of fur, I realized there was nothing more to be found in this part of the forest. the beast had likely moved on, and a full-scale surveillance would have taken several days and nights. But I didn't have that kind of time. My primary objective was to obtain proof of an utterly anomalous predator in the area, and to compare it with the family manuscripts. If all signs pointed to the presence of the dog man, I would have to prepare a much more serious plan of action. Exhausted and soaked, I returned to the house later that evening. Inside, the space reeked of dampness and darkness, as if it had absorbed the years of the village's hopelessness. I laid out the evidence I'd gathered, fragments of fur, my notes on the tracks and scratches, on an improvised table, and began comparing them with the worn descriptions in the ancient manuscripts. They spoke of creatures capable of walking on two legs, whose strength and speed far surpassed that of an ordinary wolf, and whose claw strikes could maim a victim in mere moments. Everything was consistent. Though I hadn't found specific photographs or first-hand accounts from the elders, I now had compelling evidence confirming the reality of a dangerous beast in the area. Realizing that time was short, I began a systematic analysis, charting the locations of the discovered tracks and the spots where tree scratches had been found. With every new detail, my conviction grew. This was indeed the dogman, likely stalking these remote woods at night, and if nothing was done, another victim was only a matter of time. With resolve, I decided to begin tracking the beast. I gathered my amulets, a silver-edged knife, a night vision device, and a special herbal brew which, according to ancient records, could knock a creature off its trail if splashed in the eyes. It was the dead of night when I cautiously ventured deeper into the thicket, careful to tread lightly so as not to snap any dry branches. The forest was a grim labyrinth of black trunks, intertwined branches, and swirling fog. It seemed as if even the moon had chosen not to light these places, hiding behind dense clouds. I activated my night vision device to navigate, though its field of view was limited. A heavy silence reigned, as if all living things were holding their breath, waiting for something to unfold. I listened intently for any rustle, trying to catch the sound of the beast's steps, but all I heard was the faint sway of branches and the rustle of my own clothing. Suddenly I heard the crack of a dry branch snapping. I froze, careful not to betray my presence with any sound. For a moment, in utter darkness, a shiver ran down my spine and my heart pounded. It seemed as if someone or something was moving very close, just behind a clump of bushes. I cautiously inched forward, trying to discern even a shadow, but the thick fog was impenetrable. Then I took a few slow steps, hoping the nocturnal entity would reveal itself once more. And then I saw it, a vague silhouette, taller than any human, with disproportionately long limbs. Fog swirled around it, emphasizing its inhuman nature. For a moment, a ray of moonlight broke through the clouds, and I caught the glint of its eyes, a reddish glow, as if burning from within. It seemed the creature was staring straight at me, tilting its head as if studying my form. The realization made my fear almost tangible. I quietly reached for my amulet, careful not to make a sudden movement, when I heard a low, guttural roar, a sound so alien it made the hairs on my arms stand on end. The monster slid aside, and I caught sight of powerful musculature and fur covering its body. Even though I had prepared for this encounter, reality far exceeded my expectations. In that moment, it felt as if the creature was laughing at me, taunting me with its speed and strength. Determined not to miss my chance, I dashed forward, hoping at least to get close enough to use my herbal brew. But in an instant, the creature vanished, dissolving into the dense fog. All that remained was the barely audible rustle of branches, followed by a drawn-out howl in the distance that sounded almost mocking. A reminder that in this nocturnal game, I was merely a guest, while the true master here was a monster capable of manipulating the very space around us. Feeling my knees weaken from adrenaline, I realized that for the first time in a long while, I was truly terrified. There was no longer any doubt that a beast inhabited these forests. It was the Dogman, a creature warned about in the family records. Now I had confirmed its reality and power through my own experience. I spent the rest of the night in vain attempts to find any trace. A tuft of fur, fresh footprints, or drops of blood. But I found nothing. The creature seemed to deliberately avoid direct confrontation, leaving me with a chilling sense of my own helplessness. Returning to my temporary refuge at dawn, I was utterly spent, both physically and mentally. Yet the terror had given way to focus and determination. That first encounter had shown me just how swiftly and stealthily the Dogman operated, and it reminded me that every detail mattered. My ancient scrolls described dozens of methods for banishing and capturing supernatural creatures, but each method had its subtleties, and even the smallest mistake could prove disastrously costly. I set about scavenging for suitable materials among the abandoned sheds and houses. Here and there lay rusty traps dating back to the days when wolves and bears roamed the area. I found the necessary tools: a hammer, old nails, metal bars, and some wire. Though everything was coated with dust and rust, my skills were enough to bring these finds back to a somewhat usable state. Taking several fragments of silver, I melted them in a tin can over a fire, hoping to cast small plates. According to the manuscripts, silver was the key conduit for ritual power, provided the proper symbols were etched into it. While the metal melted, I retrieved a grimoire of my lineage that detailed the patterns meant to immobilize lycanthropes. I sketched the symbols in chalk onto the cleaned surfaces of the traps. Then, once the silver had cooled, I used a crude, homemade tool to inscribe these runes onto the silver plates. The work was painstaking and demanded utmost concentration, for even the slightest distortion in the design could nullify its effect. When I finished, my hands trembled, not merely from exhaustion, but from the realization that my actions were a crucial step toward a confrontation that could only end in either victory or death. Next came the time to choose a site for setting up the traps. I selected an old mill on the edge of the village. Once, it had been full of life. Now it stood in ruins, surrounded by an open field dotted with sparse bushes and tall grass. It was an ideal spot, quiet, deserted, and removed from the houses where people still lingered. I suspected that the Dogman might frequent this area. Perhaps it had its own path or lair nearby. I resolved to set the traps there and fortify the territory with protective symbols. By evening, I reached the mill. The building resembled the gaping maw of a beast, with part of the roof collapsed, beams jutting out at odd angles, and the wheel long since overgrown with moss. Inside, a dim half-light and the stench of rotting planks pervaded the space. I chose a small corner beneath the remains of a staircase and arranged several traps there, expertly camouflaging them with fallen leaves and twigs. Around each trap, I etched protective signs and laid small strips of silver on top. Then, near the entrance, I left bait, a chunk of meat soaked in a special herbal tincture designed to stir predatory instincts. According to the manuscripts, even a cunning dogman could not resist the scent of fresh blood, especially when mixed with certain ingredients, including a drop of the hunter's own blood. At last, all that remained was to wait for nightfall. I climbed up to what remained of the second floor, from where I had a clear view of the entire interior of the crumbling mill. There I prepared my shelter and set out several protective amulets. Dusk fell rapidly, and the village seemed utterly dead. A wind swirled around the mill, driving clumps of fog about while I peered into the emptiness, straining to catch the slightest sound or movement. I knew that this night might prove decisive. Still, I understood that even the best-laid trap offers no guarantee when dealing with a creature whose abilities and fury surpass those of any earthly animal. I spent the entire previous night in futile anticipation outside the abandoned mill. The fog thickened, and a biting cold wind seeped relentlessly through the old walls, shaking what remained of the roof. Every so often, strange sounds reached my ears, the crunch of snapping branches and soft creaks. But throughout the night the dogman did not appear. The tension only grew. The longer the beast stayed away, the stronger my impression became that it was stalking me, just as I was stalking it. With the first gray rays of dawn, I withdrew, considering the possibility of choosing another location or altering my tactics. Yet, after weighing all the facts, I resolved to stick with the original plan. Sometimes, creatures like this linger to test the trap after detecting the presence of a hunter. I knew that if I stayed, sooner or later the cryptid would reveal itself. Then came the second night, just as dark and impenetrable as the first. The sense of silent menace grew with every passing minute. I sat in my shelter on the second floor, keeping a vigilant eye on the traps below and on the bait that was beginning to emit a faint, sweet odor of decay. Time seemed to stretch endlessly. I repeated lines from the manuscripts under my breath, fighting sleep and the encroaching fog of fear and fatigue. Finally, close to midnight, I heard a soft shuffling at the mill's entrance. In the pre-dawn darkness, it appeared as though a black shadow, half merging with the fog, had slid inside. I held my breath and slowly reached for my night vision device. Its flickering display revealed vague outlines below, a tall, muscular figure covered in dense fur with a sharply pointed snout. The dogman seemed to hover near the entrance as if sensing something amiss. It moved cautiously, head lowered and ears perked. The tension of that moment was nearly unbearable. My heart pounded so fiercely that each beat reverberated in my skull. I knew that if the creature realized it had been lured, it would try to flee, and then I would have to chase it out into the open. I watched as the creature approached the bait, sniffing the air. At one point, it abruptly raised its head and looked directly at me. Even from a distance, I could feel our gazes intersect, its red eyes piercing into my very soul, evoking a primal terror. But I did not flinch. In that same instant, I put my plan into action. I quietly lowered my lever, and from a corner of the mill came the faint click of a mechanical mechanism, a contraption wrapped in wire and scorched runes, snapping shut with a barely audible sound. However, relying on its animal instinct, the dogman darted away within fractions of a second, bouncing aside only to run into the radius of other traps. Metal clanged harshly, and I heard a furious roar. One of the traps clamped down on the creature's paw, and an ear-splitting cry of pain and rage echoed through the decaying beams. The beast thrashed wildly, scratching the floor and walls with its claws, emitting a sound that was part growl, part hoarse wail, a tormenting mix of a wounded animal's agony and an aggressive protest. I leapt down, knowing that any hesitation in such a situation was deadly. Before the cryptid could break free from the trap and attack me, I had only a brief window to finish what I had come for. Landing on the lower level of the mill, I nearly slipped on the rotten boards. The dogman roared and bared its fangs, desperately trying to wrench its paw free from the steel jaws of the trap. The metal, inscribed with sacred runes, seemed to burn the creature not only physically, it thrashed in such fury as if tormented by excruciating pain mixed with fear. I felt the very atmosphere around us charged with sizzling energy, as though the creature's power was clashing with those ancient symbols. Gathering myself, I activated the protective amulet clutched in my left hand, a small silver plate upon which I had burned a special combination of signs mentioned in one of my ancestral books. The symbol flared with a faint bluish glow, and the dogman froze for a moment as if struck by a powerful shock. Seizing that moment, I moved within striking distance and delivered a blow with a knife coated in a special substance designed to sever the creature's link to its otherworldly strength. The blade plunged deep between its ribs, and at that moment the beast emitted a hellish shriek, arched its back, and lunged so violently that I nearly lost my grip on the handle. After withdrawing my knife, I felt the creature's fur was hot and damp with a dark fluid reminiscent of blood, only thicker and darker, almost black. Knowing I had to finish it quickly, I pressed the amulet even harder, reciting the incantations from the manuscripts, prayer-like ritual phrases that, according to legend, strip a lycanthrope of its remaining power to resist. The dogman fell to its knees, then collapsed on its side, thrashing convulsively on the floor. Its red eyes still burned with malice, but its fury gradually ebbed, giving way to the agonizing realization of imminent death. Once I was convinced that the creature could no longer fight, I moved to the final phase of the ritual. According to the ancestral scrolls, one was never to leave the body of the creature untouched. It had to be destroyed so that the ancient power might not be resurrected by fanatics or fall into the hands of those who would use it for their own ends. I swung open the old mill gates and dragged the body outside. In a nearby field, I built a fire using scraps of dry wood and rags found among the ruins. Though lifeless, the creature's body still exuded a sinister aura that made my inner resolve tremble. When the fire roared to life, I tossed the beast's body into the flames. The fire soon licked at its fur, sending up puffs of black ash, and the choking stench forced me to cover my mouth. Recalling the ancestral law, I drew my silver knife and severed the cryptid's head as ancient custom demanded, to utterly dispel its enchantments. Finally, I hurled the head directly into the highest tongues of flame, watching as it charred under the intense heat. It all ended swiftly, though for me the ordeal had felt like an endless journey through terror and the resistance of otherworldly forces. When the fire finally died down, all that remained of the dogman were a few burnt fragments. But I still retrieved and stowed the charred head in a sack, a token of my victory and a symbol that yet another ancient evil had been consigned to oblivion. I felt the adrenaline draining from my body, giving way to overwhelming exhaustion. Yet I knew. My mission was not complete until I performed the ritual of remembrance and interred that ghastly trophy according to family tradition. As the first streaks of dawn tinted the horizon with pale gray hues, I secured the charred dogman head in a heavy sack and departed the village. The darkness gradually receded, though the residue of nightmarish visions still lingered within me. No light shone in the abandoned windows, and I knew that the local residents would hardly realize immediately that the terrible threat had been eliminated. Perhaps they would sense a change in the air, notice that the night's terrible howls had ceased, but it was unlikely they would ever think, "The monster is dead." And for most, that truth wasn't needed. They would prefer to forget their nightmares and carry on, dismissing them as nothing more than village tales. My path then led to the ancestral home, nestled deep in the forest far from the big cities. All the trails that had borne members of my family on their cryptid hunts for generations converged there. As I approached the creaking gates, I heard a familiar echo from the past. The crunch of gravel under wheels, the dry rustle of leaves, the clinking of chains in the wind. The sky grew dark, threatening a prolonged rain, as if nature itself wished to wash away all that had transpired in recent days. Stepping over the threshold, I was greeted by the familiar scent of dried herbs, candle wax, and antiquity. The aroma that always met me upon returning from a hunt. In the main hall, leather-bound books lined the shelves. Here was kept the essence of our lineage, recorded not in ink, but in blood and the sweat of many generations. As I entered, something within me tightened. Each time I returned, I remembered all who had practiced this grim art before me. I was the keeper of a tradition, stern and ruthless but necessary to ensure that the world remained under the illusion of safety. With the sack in hand, I ventured deeper into the forest, beyond the house, to where the so-called Well of Remembrance lay. It was a deep well lined with heavy stones, descending many meters into the earth, its walls inscribed with runes designed to suppress any residual energy that might cling to the remnants of cryptids. Approaching the edge, I lit a candle and placed it on a ledge, illuminating the moss-covered stone walls and ancient symbols. The pounding of my heart echoed dully, and an age-old profound silence enveloped the area. When I untied the sack, a barely perceptible odor of char and something ineffably sinister struck my nostrils. The charred head of the creature was almost unrecognizable. Only a few features of its snout could be discerned by someone who knew where to look. Yet in the dead sockets of its eyes lingered the faint trace of the dreadful power the dogman had possessed in life. I carefully lowered the head into the well, adhering to the protocol set forth in one of the oldest books of my family. Bury the beast in the earth of remembrance, so that its terror may never rise again in this world. When the head struck the stone floor at the bottom, I performed a simple ritual over the well, sprinkling a small amount of ash gathered from the burning body, and reciting ancient words meant by legend to seal away the lingering essence of the cryptid soul. For a moment, it seemed as though an echo, a whisper or a moan, rose from the depths. But I paid it no heed. I knew it was only my imagination, stirring the terrors of the night past. Around the rim of the well, several skulls and remains from my previous hunts, and those of my ancestors, were arranged. Each bore the history of our defiance against the mythical creatures that humanity had chosen to expunge from its conscious world. I saw a massive, time-eroded skull with fangs reminiscent of vampiric legends, and another adorned with horns seemingly torn from the very folklore of demons. These grim relics served as a reminder. We exist on the thin line between the world of men and that of forgotten magic. After sealing the well with a heavy stone lid and securing it with chains, I felt the burden of the entire hunt lift from my shoulders. The dogman would not return. Leaning against an ancient tree at the entrance to my estate, I closed my eyes. Inside, fatigue warred with an odd lightness, as if I had fulfilled my duty, completed the mission that was destined for me. Yet I also understood that this was only one of many battles. The old manuscripts warned, the world is full of beings ready to awaken when people stop believing in their reality. My family's tradition will endure as long as ancient shadows continue to roam the night. Later that evening, I returned to the house, lit the lamps, and retrieved the manuscripts from the cupboard to record yet another entry. I needed to document everything that had transpired, the signs and behaviors of the dogman, the method of capture, and the rituals used to neutralize it. I knew that someday Someone from my lineage would read these lines just as I once read about the triumphs and failures of my forebears. Finishing the entry, a quiet pride filled me. A recognition that an ancient legend had been vanquished and now lay interred in the depths of the well of remembrance. At one point, a gust of wind buffeted me, and I glanced out the window. In the rustling of the leaves, I thought I heard an echo of a distant howl. And though I knew it was more likely a product of my imagination, one thought remained clear within me. Fear, legends, and mysteries never truly die. Perhaps there will come another hour when another creature rises in the night and demands a new sacrifice. But I will be ready, for it is my destiny, my burden, and my fate. And as long as my heart beats, I will stand guard to protect the boundary between the world of men and the shadow of forgotten horror lurking in the darkness. Story 2. I remember that day when I stood before the map of the United States, unable to make a final decision. I wanted to escape the routine I had imposed on myself. Endless attempts to write stories, days spent in front of a computer in a futile search for inspiration. I was young and full of energy, yet somehow everything kept going awry. My friend suggested we head to Texas, where he had an old shack on wheels, but I hesitated. Back then, I had no idea that this would mark the beginning of my darkest tale. In the end, I decided to go for it. We packed up our few belongings, loaded them into a pickup truck, hitched a trailer, and set off. Fragmented ideas for a new novel swirled in my head, strange images and themes that all felt completely contrived. I sensed that my previous life had stagnated and that Texas offered a chance to break free from that dead end. Originally, we planned to live in the trailer only briefly until we found something more suitable. However, circumstances conspired to extend our stay. We couldn't find work, and we had to economize on everything. Days passed in a dusty, scorching suburb where every evening mirrored the one before. My friend would leave for odd jobs while I remained alone. I'd sit, staring blankly at an empty text document, hoping that something in my mind would finally click. Yet time and again, I was met with a lack of ideas. At times, it seemed as if I was simply running away from myself, that the move was just an attempt to change the scenery, while the real problem lay much deeper within. One day, I realized that my money was nearly gone, and my creativity had yet to bear fruit. My friend mentioned that he knew a woman who rented out inexpensive rooms in her country house. This seemed like a lifeline, a proper roof over my head, silence free from street noise, and the promise of solitude. I dreamed that the quiet and peace would help me focus on a new project. The scent of freedom, a new environment, everything looked enticing. When we drove up to what was to be my new home, a surge of anticipation overcame me. The bumpy road, towering clouds of dust, and the sparse trees all around. I felt that something entirely different awaited me there. Perhaps even a fresh start. Little did I know that this place would turn out to be yet another dead end, and that the turn toward the house would be a ticket straight into the abyss of my darkest fears. But I was too exhausted to back down. With a tinge of melancholy, as I glanced back at our trailer, I decided it was time to risk everything for that elusive chance to recapture my muse and finally regain my zest for life. Upon entering the house, I noticed the pleasant coolness and the soft, dim light that pervaded the hallway. The landlady greeted me with restrained warmth, giving me an appraising look as she indicated where to drop my backpack. Out of the corner of my eye, I caught a glimpse of a shadow, her daughter slipping into a nearby room. The air around this unfamiliar family carried a tense unease. but I chalked it up to my own jumpiness. When I was shown to my room, I couldn't help but notice a peculiar smell. A mix of old wood, dust, and something else, vaguely unpleasant. The windows were draped with heavy curtains that let in only scattered light, and the floors creaked whenever stepped on in certain spots. In one corner stood a wardrobe with peeling paint, and it almost seemed as if it was watching me with its faded doors, like a living creature. I tried to ignore these sensations. Every house has its quirks, after all. After the landlady left, I carefully inspected the room and found something unexpected under the bed. A pack of cigarettes with a brand name I didn't recognize, almost empty and with its logo rubbed off. I was struck by how neatly it was hidden, as if someone didn't want it to be found. Beneath the bed, I also discovered several scraps of strange papers scrawled with uneven lines. I couldn't make out the text. The letters were smudged, and some words seemed nonsensical. A vague fear stirred inside me, but I quickly decided that perhaps these remnants belonged to the previous tenant. As I made my way back to the exit down the hall, I noticed the landlady hastily tucking something into a dresser drawer. I didn't want to pry, yet I couldn't shake the feeling that she was hiding something. I also saw her daughter standing behind a door, watching me intently through a narrow gap. Our eyes met for just a second, but it seemed as though tension flickered in her gaze. Suddenly the girl vanished, as if dissolving into the half-light. That night, sleep eluded me. I listened as the house seemed to breathe, emitting barely audible rustlings. It felt as though I would have to get used not only to the creaking floors, but also to the many hidden secrets that clearly lurked within these walls. I sensed that change was truly underway, but I couldn't tell which direction it would lead me. The next day, the landlady offered to let me check out the storage room if I needed extra space. It was cramped, dusty, and reeked of stale air. On the walls, I noticed faded photographs, one of which immediately caught my eye. A man with a mischievous smile seated beside a hunting trophy. The picture looked relatively new, as if it had been taken out and put back often. The edges were worn. A strange unease settled over me. The man's gaze seemed to pierce through me with a living, furious energy. Later, the landlady mentioned that this man was her nephew, and that he had committed suicide in a small copse not far from the house. I felt an inward tightening. Suicide always stirred heavy thoughts within me. I couldn't understand why the woman would keep his photo out in the open if such a tragic event had occurred. But I didn't press for details, understanding that everyone copes with loss in their own way. She explained that after his death, strange things began to happen in the house. Footsteps in the middle of the night, scratches appearing on the walls, and sometimes knocks on the windows and doors. At first, everyone assumed it was stray animals or mischievous teenagers. But over time, it became impossible to ignore what was happening. I listened with a heavy heart. Once again, I recalled that photograph of the man with the piercing eyes, who now seemed to have transformed into someone's ghost. I couldn't shake the feeling that the landlady wasn't telling me everything. Before long, I found myself standing by the window, waiting, hoping to see a figure in the dark courtyard. The idea of the paranormal had once struck me as a mere fanciful invention, nothing more. But here, in the damp, mystery-laden air, everything felt different. Every rustle evoked echoes of superstitious dread deep within my soul. I tried to convince myself that it was just my imagination running wild. After all, I'd come here seeking inspiration. Perhaps my mind was too quick to latch on to the unusual. Soon after that conversation, I noticed that the landlady began acting even more cautiously. Sometimes, when I passed by, she would abruptly halt her activities and, as if caught off guard, pretend nothing was happening. Her daughter avoided me, as if afraid to speak, yet I could feel her gaze fixed on me. An unseen weight seemed to hang in the air, as if the house was waiting for a new burst of inexplicable, sinister activity. And I wasn't sure anymore whether I truly wanted to learn the truth about this place. That night, I woke up with the sensation that someone had gently touched my shoulder. The room was shrouded in twilight, with only the moonlight filtering through the curtains to reveal vague outlines of the furniture. I bolted upright, my heart pounding furiously. There was no one there, yet I couldn't shake the thought that another presence lingered nearby. I got up and circled the room, checking to see if the door had been left ajar. Everything was in its place, but my unease persisted. Later, as I finally drifted back to sleep, I began to hear a barely perceptible sound, like nails scraping against wood. The noise seemed to come from the floor, perhaps from under the bed or even from within the wall. I waited a few minutes, hoping it would stop, but the sound resumed. Again came creaks, scratches, a series of short, jerky sounds. A surge of panic made me imagine tentacles or animal paws rustling beneath the bed. I shivered, picturing indistinct figures moving in the darkness. By morning, I found clear evidence of my nocturnal fears. Deep scratch marks along the wall, as if someone had dragged claws across it. I tried to come up with a rational explanation, but looking at those distinct lines, they seemed too large to have been made by a cat or any small creature. A vague dread continued to grow within me, and I even began avoiding the mirror hanging over the dresser, because sometimes it seemed as though something flickered behind my reflection. Once in the hallway, I caught a glimpse of a huge shadow slipping past the mirror. I turned, but there was no one there. Yet my skin prickled, and I detected a strange, almost animalistic odor, a mix of dampness, a musky tang, and old fur. The smell vanished as quickly as it had appeared, leaving me bewildered. I tried to convince myself that it was merely an overactive imagination, but my words offered little comfort. By evening, I came across an old mirror at the far end of the corridor and paused to examine my own reflection. My face appeared alien, too tense, my eyes filled with anxiety and sleep deprivation. For a moment, it seemed as if a vague silhouette loomed behind me. I spun around, but the corridor was empty. The strange occurrences were mounting, as if some force was beginning to act with increasing boldness. And the more I tried to find an explanation, the deeper I sank into the eerie atmosphere of that house. When the landlady and her daughter left to visit relatives, I found myself completely alone in the house. The empty corridors echoed with the sound of my own footsteps. I thought that spending an entire week by myself might even benefit my creativity. But on the very first night, nightmares seized me, leaving me drenched in cold sweat. In my dreams, I saw a figure wandering through the house, half human, half beast. Its eyes glowed with a reddish light, and thick drool dripped from its mouth. The creature seemed to glide rather than walk, moving from room to room as if it were sniffing the air. I would wake up unable to tell whether it had been a dream or reality, and I couldn't bring myself to get out of bed. The next day, I caught a glimpse of my reflection in a mirror, and was horrified to see that my eyes had darkened, and my gaze had taken on a wild, feral quality. I blinked, and the monstrous vision vanished, but the unsettling feeling remained. Every corner of the house now reminded me of the constant presence of something otherworldly. At times, it seemed that a creature resembling a werewolf was watching me from a doorway or hiding behind a wardrobe. The silence during the day pressed down on me, while at night, the terror became unbearable. In an effort to distract myself, I tried to write, but the words that spilled onto the page were soaked in an infernal sense of hopelessness and despair. It was as if the dark energy of the house was infecting me. One morning, I decided to explore the attic. The staircase creaked ominously under my weight, and the darkness reeked of stale fabric and mustiness. I moved cautiously, illuminating my path with a flashlight. On the floor, I discovered large, strange footprints that looked like animal tracks. On closer inspection, I saw that they formed an irregular trail leading to where several torn paper bags lay scattered, as if a large beast had been rummaging around in search of prey. My knees trembled, and I hurriedly descended, slamming the hatch behind me. That same evening, everything worsened. A gust of wind rose outside, scattering dry leaves, and it seemed as though the very walls of the house began to creak. I sat on the bed, trying to ignore my mounting panic. Yet through the howl of the wind, I heard heavy footsteps in the corridor. Then a soft breath sounded right by the door of my room. It circled around, only to fade away by early morning. I dared not leave my room until the trembling light of dawn sliced through the curtains, dispelling that ancient primal terror. Not long after that dreadful evening, I went to wash up and paused before the bathroom mirror. I was struck by how utterly worn I looked. Sunken cheeks, red circles beneath my eyes, and a nervous tremor at the corners of my lips. Suddenly, my reflection began to change. My eyes turned sinister, my cheekbones appeared harsher, as if my face were hardening and losing its human softness. In the mirror, I saw not myself, but something beastly. Broad cheekbones, protruding fangs, and a deformed, half-formed snout. An involuntary cry escaped from deep within my chest, and I recoiled instinctively. The mirror soon returned my normal face, though my gaze was still distorted by terror. I bolted into the corridor, desperate to escape that horrifying vision. Midway, I slipped on something sticky. Underfoot was a dark, damp puddle. A smell reminiscent of a wet animal hit my nostrils. In that moment, I heard a scraping sound behind me, as if claws were raking along the wall. I turned to see a blurry shadow, the very creature that had haunted my dreams and visions. It was taller than a man and moved with a predatory grace, as if poised to leap. Panic flared within me. I ran toward the living room, pressing myself against the wall to avoid a face-to-face encounter with that monster. Its pace grew louder with every step, each footfall echoing ominously. The sound of fur, or perhaps hide, accompanied every turn it took. When I finally reached my room's door, my hands trembled so badly that I struggled to slam it shut and lock it. My heart pounded as though it were trying to burst free, and I could almost hear my blood pounding in my ears. In that terrible moment, I heard the creature clawing at the door from the outside. The sound of scratching on wood alternated with low growls. It seemed as if the door was about to give way. I felt utterly helpless, devoid of any weapon or plan. I was trapped with my own fear, not knowing whether the beast would break in and tear me apart. Gradually, the scraping grew quieter, but I couldn't tell whether it had left or was merely lurking, waiting for the perfect moment. Every time the footsteps died down, I froze, barely daring to breathe, expecting that at any second, that dreadful shadow would once again press against the door. I was caught in a trap with no escape, knowing that the night was far from over, and uncertain if I would ever see dawn. I spent 2 days holed up in that room, barely leaving the floor. Time stretched on, turning hours into an endless torrent of fear and exhaustion. I made every effort to be as quiet as possible, avoiding any movement near the door, terrified that even the slightest sound might once again attract that creature. My head spun from hunger and thirst, yet I couldn't bring myself to venture out. Every rustle outside the wall sounded like the monster's steps, ready to carve out my throat. By the third day, I began to lose my grip on reality. Images of a werewolf prowling the corridors flashed through my mind, only to be replaced by memories of a time when I lived carefree, believing that everything was ahead of me. I tried to distract myself with recollections of home, of loved ones, and my creative dreams, but all these memories seemed to fade under the onslaught of terror. I drifted in and out of a half-sleep, caught between a painful wakefulness and a delirious drowsiness. Then voices echoed through the house. I couldn't believe my ears. The voices were human. With great caution, I cracked open the door and saw that the landlady had returned. Her face was etched with shock and horror when she saw me in the disarray in the hallway. I realized that the house had transformed into a branch of nightmares. Scratches everywhere, torn pieces of fabric scattered about, and inexplicable dark stains on the floor. The woman clearly sensed that something terrible had occurred, though I couldn't explain it to her, and didn't want to. She helped me out into the yard, where I took a deep breath of fresh air, feeling for the first time in days a hint of safety. The landlady's daughter stood off to the side, her eyes full of fear. I noticed that she looked as though she hadn't slept in ages. It seemed that they both intuitively knew the reasons behind it all, yet neither wanted to delve into the details. Recalling her tales about her late nephew, I understood. This place had always harbored something frightening and dark, perhaps awakened by his death. It soon became clear that living here was no longer possible. The house was in a state of irreversible decay, steeped in fear and secrets. I decided to leave without delay, gathered what little I had left, and called my friend to pick me up. The landlady silently watched me leave, as if she understood that I was departing for good, taking with me only memories of nightmares. I couldn't tell if that creature would remain in the house or if it would start following me. The only feeling I had was the urge to run while I still had the strength. Back home, I struggled for a long time to recover. Every sound, every dimly lit room triggered uncontrollable panic within me. I could barely sleep, and when I did, nightmares tormented me, replaying the hideous creature clawing at the door. Even amid the daytime hustle, shadows and reflections from store windows or building glass would haunt me. I made a point of avoiding mirrors, fearful of meeting that terrible visage once more. Weeks passed, yet relief never came. I was horrified by the thought that I remained a prisoner of my own fears. My attempts to return to writing collapsed under the weight of the hellish sense of despair that seeped into every line I wrote. There came a moment when I suspected that this creature, a being that had taken the form of a werewolf, had somehow settled in my mind or even my soul. One day, I noticed something new in my reflection. My eyes flashed with malice once again, and my cheekbones appeared even more defined, almost feral. It lasted only a second, but it was enough to send chills down my spine. I realized then that I couldn't completely shake off the ghosts of the past. It was as if the connection between me and that house, and more specifically, between me and the creature I had seen, remained unbreakable. In that moment, I felt something primitive and wild awakening deep within my soul, ready to shatter all barriers if given the chance. Now, I avoid not only mirrors but any reflective surfaces. I steer clear of murky river water, avoid glancing at the shiny metal of an elevator, and try not to catch my own reflection in windows. The mere sight of my face in any glass sends a jolt of terror through me. What if, in that very moment, I see not my own face, but a twisted bestial visage with a snarl and eyes that gleam red? I do my best to stay away from dark rooms and secluded wooded corners, because in the silent night, that familiar soul-chilling scraping might once again resound. The past hangs over me like a curse. I don't know when the day will come when I hear the sound of something scraping in the foyer at night, or see its shadow lurking under the bed. Perhaps, deep in my own soul, I am already turning into what I fear most. Even though I left that house, its gloomy essence, a presence reminiscent of a werewolf, has clung to me. That feeling won't let me go. It seems it will never release its grip on me, slowly turning my nights into a continuation of that endless nightmare.